All right, so we're coming back in here for our second session here. We're going to try and build this up a little further, going right on top of what we have painted so far. Depending on what colors you're using and the canvas you're using, you may need to oil this out. I don't think I need to oil this out right now, but if I did, I would just select some oil like linseed oil, and then using a cloth, gently rub it over the area, or a paper towel as long as it doesn't leave any lint. And then make sure it doesn't build up too much excess oil on here. Now as I start to lay in, you'll notice I'm using smaller brushes than the last sitting. I'm gonna shoot for a little more detail, shoot for a few more transitions in between each area, and lay in the paint a little stronger, perhaps a little thicker than last sitting. Really start to build some of this up. It isn't quite yet to the stage where I need to, I should be thinking about some scumbling. Although there may be some areas where it's getting close. But I'm still in some areas just trying to get close to the right color and the right value. I didn't quite make it there last sitting. But we're getting close, and I'm just kind of tiling on little bits and little bits and little bits. You'll notice too I'm also focusing more in on a single area and trying to zero in on it and finish it out. If I can at least get one area, built up a little more to what I want it to end up as, then that can help me to gauge the rest of this a little bit more. So we'll try and build up one area. Oops. Oh, it was way too light. Try and lift that out there. Notice how I'm holding my brush quite a bit more parallel to the canvas. I'm wanting to really just lay this paint on gently. And luckily, with a limited palette, your choices for color mixtures are quite a bit smaller than a full palette. If you can consider that I should reasonably be able to get most, if not all, of the colors I see up there with a limited palette, then my choices really only become more red, yellow, blue, or white. And so each little mixture I make, I kind of have to make that decision. I compare what I have here to what I see there, ask myself how close is it, and if it's off, then do I need to add a little more yellow, red, blue, or white? What you'll also notice with this is the closer I am to the reference and the more subtle this becomes, the more a seemingly insignificant value or color shift will pop out as being potentially incorrect. And we saw the same thing with drawing. As we approached more the finished stages of the drawing, if everything on here is really clean and looking really correct, and then you put one on there that's wrong, it really tends to stand out. And you have to make sure you address that right away. All right. Hold up some of these lights a little bit. So the challenge with this can be, if you're not used to it, is to really getting enough paint on here to really make this stand out. Especially because as beginners, we have this tendency where if we've placed a color and it's the incorrect value, for whatever reason we try to go lighter with it, or press more firmly with it to kind of alter the value, and it's using almost this sort of transparency idea intuitively. Most people don't know they do it. It's one of the reasons why we lick so much, I think, lick the canvas. And you kind of, to a certain degree, are trying to blend what you've put with what's underneath there to get the value you think it needs to be, instead of going back and remixing the correct value. And you know, I didn't notice it for a long time that I did that and others did that. And I tend to find that when I avoid that and I go into just trying to mix exactly the right color and lay it down, even if it's laying down a little more thickly, then my colors tend to be nicer, and when they dry they tend to be a little more pleasant. They don't shift as much in the drying process. But one way you'll be able to tell is if at the end of the painting session, if you don't have a substantial amount of paint built up on your canvas, it means you probably weren't painting thickly enough, you know, for something like this. I tend to notice the paintings progress quite a bit slower the further along you go, because you start to make these really, really micro changes on the canvas. And this becomes hard for students too, because they'll get to a point where, you know, something like what we have on here with the torso, and not really know what to do next. And one of the things that's always helped me, especially with the copy, is to just assume that I haven't gotten there yet, and assume I'm missing something and I just need to look harder, or maybe isolate a little more to see a little more information. Make sure all my transitions have a color that's actually mixed from one area to the next, and not just a couple colors that I've blended together. And sort of force myself to see more information, to see more transitions. Otherwise, you end up quitting prematurely at something that looks about right, and that's not the goal here. You don't want to get it about right. You want to get it as close as you can actually physically make it to what it is you're copying. And then when you go to paint something on your own, you'll take a little bit of that perceptive ability with you. You'll be able to see a little bit more when you're working from life. And maybe each time you paint, you'll paint one extra little transition step from light to dark, and that could be the difference between vibrant, clean, brilliant colors and something that gets muddied out. But you're always going to learn to see better and see more and have a more fine-tuned eye, and that's part of what an art education should be about, because really the concepts we're dealing with of shape and value and edge and color are relatively simple. It's most everybody understands that without any question. The challenge becomes in implementing it and learning how to see what we're talking about here, learning how to see transitions between light and dark and how much color they have, and learning how to see what colors are without the influence of our brain trying to override and give us local color information. You know, all of this takes a long, long time to learn. And you can't just get to a point where something looks about right and think you've got it as good as you can get it. You just have to push yourself further to see more. It becomes tough too when you have family or friends look at your work, because most people are kind of in that mindset where, you know, about good is nice, especially if you've never done something like this before and you do something that's about right. You know, people are going to get really excited, and your family's going to get really excited and say how great it is. If you don't understand that they're not trying to see things on the level that you're trying to see things, it can become tempting to just kind of leave it at that. You know, just because everybody else thinks you've hit the nail on the head doesn't necessarily mean you have. And you should make sure you're asking a really skilled technician of the arts to be certain you're pushing it as far as you can. Otherwise, it's all too tempting to stop prematurely. Notice each time I bounce to a different area to work on, I have to kind of key into that area. And so oftentimes it takes me, especially with a limited palette, several attempts here to get to a color that matches the surrounding area. And then from there I can dive into changing up the color and adding the information I need to. For me, at least, it's a little easier to launch into an area when I'm utilizing a full palette, just because the method I use or approach a full palette makes it a little easier to hit it, because I end up just dealing with 3 colors. Once I figure out the value, I'm just using the red, yellow, and blue of that value, so I'm not worrying about white. Whereas here, you know, I need to mix the correct amount of white for each of these areas, and so I often miss that in a limited palette, because I'm starting a new puddle, and that puddle can be completely different than anything that's up there. And on my palette, it might look like I'm really close to the right color or right value, but then on the actual painting, I could be pretty far off. So it can take me a few tries to lock into the right area. I don't really have any highlights on the painting that I'm working on here, but I'm starting to deal with some light areas in here as I build up the stomach here and the breast. And one of the things you'll notice, which is peculiar, and you can kind of see how it works in here nicely, but when you're mixing up really light lights and highlights, it can become easy for things to get sort of chalky and washed out. And so one of the ways artists get around that is by not letting their highlight colors mix together, but pack a whole bunch of information in a small area, a whole bunch of color information in one small area. So for example, in here, there's pinks and blues next to each other, and they're offset by the yellows over here. So instead of actually mixing the pink and the blue and flat out making a purple for that sort of highlight area, you kind of build one color next to another. And there's some artists who will put in these tiny little slices of color for a highlight of, maybe a red and a yellow or something like that next to each other to put more color information into a highlight area instead of flat out mixing an orange, because your colors can stay more intense and pure. I need, though, to try and remember as I work this to, for the most part, any area I'm intending on coming over with the scumble the last day, to keep a little bit darker, because when I come in with the scumble, I want that scumble to be light on top of a dark area. So if I play up my lights too much right now on an area I want to scumble, then I'm not going to have any room left to go lighter. My scumbles will make things too light, and I'll lose my values in that area. That was a good point too, where I should start to lay in some information in the background here and get that a little closer. If I can get that background closer, then I can start to better key and fine-tune some of these mixtures of the flesh. Start to lay some of this in here. It's kind of a yellows and blues back in there. And this is the same too, I'm probably gonna come in here next session, at least to some degree, laying in some scumbles in that background to pull that lighter, but I'm gonna maybe try and get as close as I can here with these colors, and then just tidy it up next week as needed. And that's dark in there. I'm kind of using the side of my brush in a lot of the instance here to sort of scrape on the paint. Create some of that texture back there. Some of that light over the dark. See, as I'm starting to lay this background color in, which is a little easier for me to gauge just because I'm not worried about any particular shape, I'm starting to see where I may have gone a little too pink in some of the flesh tone, especially in the middle of the body here. I may need to pull it to a little bit greener in there. this style of painting where I'm not really concerning myself with the brush work, it does help quite a bit to hold my brush at the back handle like this. So I'm really just setting pieces of paint on there, and that's kind of the mindset that I have. I'm not so much trying to make specific brush marks. It's just lay a piece of paint on, lay a piece of paint on, lay a piece of paint on. And it also allows actually greater control in getting your angle of the brush. You know, if I'm holding a brush like this, it becomes really difficult to lay the paint down and set it on top of the canvas. But if I'm holding it at the back, it becomes quite a bit easier to pull that off. Now some of these final lights of the background, I'll probably be able to come in next week and do my final finishing scumbles on there. But I can get pretty close. I just don't want to lose all the variety that I have in the background now. So that's why I need to be just careful of there. So if I go to add in a few more of these, I have to make sure that my brush is held delicate enough so that I'm kind of gliding over the paint that's already there and not actually mixing with it or pulling it away, because I want some of that to speckle through. And that becomes a lot easier to do if you've let the paint sit and let it dry a little bit. Otherwise, that temptation will be to apply the wrong pressure and scrape away what you have down there already. All right. I need to start building in some more values in the torso here to help trim the pelvis, and then work up into the armpit area in here, clean up the shape a little bit before we get to the end today. So the idea being with a type of painting like this is that I'm going to strive to work all over and cover as much of this as I can before the end of the session here. And then when it comes to the last day, when I feel like I've got everything set up really well and it looks like I can go in for my finishing strokes, then I'll kind of slow down and focus on one area at a time. But I want to build all this up, get closer and closer and closer. So as I add each little piece of paint, it can help to inform me everywhere else in the painting. Again, I'm using pure paint, no medium. Just trying to set all these tiles on fairly boldly. to make sure as I start to work through this torso again that I get it enough the green flesh tone that I think it needs to be now after putting that background in. It's not hugely green. And you know, I get a lot of students who will kind of argue maybe the colors that I see here by me saying, you know, I think, oh, this is sort of green, needs to be more greenish in here. But it's all kind of just relative. I'm not saying it's actually literally green. I'm not saying I need to mix up some green paint and throw it in the torso. That wouldn't necessarily look right. But what I am saying is that when I am looking at the overall image here, I'm noticing that there needs to be a little more lean towards yellow, a little more lean towards blue in this area in here to knock down some of the pinkish orange that I see. And so you know, the argument I get all the time is, well, I don't see green. I see it as purple or orangish, or you know, well, most beginners will say I see it as flesh tone color, not as green. Well, you know, flesh tone can be any color. Just keep in mind that it's all relative. So even if you don't see literally green there, if you get the correct relationship established, it'll probably look greenish to some effect in here. I haven't literally come in and painted green anywhere in here, but it's starting to read as a little more greenish relative to other areas. You have to be careful too, because I know some painters who will go sort of the opposite, where they'll let their perception of the relationship of colors override their mixing choices. So, you know, where I am saying I need to add a little more of a yellow-blue influence here, they will actually literally add green, and then you get some really crazy colors all over the place, and might leave the realm of believability. And then they call themselves colorists because they say they see so much more color, and so they paint so much more color. But it really becomes about control. You know, how subtly can you state something? Especially, you know, with an artist like these classical artists like Alma. Everything in here is just so subtle. We have to make sure we match that subtlety while we're painting. So everything I'm putting on here are just tiny little dabs of color. You know, and in the spirit of trying to put on a substantial piece of color and not just sort of softly feather something on, I am using bristle brushes for all of this. And, you know, that was common back then. Alma and Bouguereau, you know, they would have used bristle brushes for the majority of their paint application. And they may or may not go back later with a softer brush to feather them out. You know, Bouguereau was known for having said he thought it humorous that people thought his paintings were so soft and feathered because he never touched a sable brush. He always used bristles. if nothing else out of this demonstration, you should get through the idea that there's no special formula to any of these color mixtures. Really, all I'm adding is just red and yellow and blue, and in this case it happens to be a uniform red and yellow and blue. One of the most common questions we tend to get in demonstrations is, what color are you mixing for that flesh tone? And to most artists, that seems such an irrelevant question, because most artists, at least nowadays, are not operating formulaically like artists used to historically. You know, historically there would be a process of building up the head in which you'd do sort of this underpainting in green, and then let the green show through in the halftones, and then lay your lights on top, and then your dark accents on the bottom. And it was so formulaic because they weren't, for the most part, referring at all to nature. And then we had large movements in which we started to look more and more to nature. And now most artists, at least most of the artists that I know and talk to, don't have any set formula for mixing flesh tone. Although it's interesting that you typically can recognize an artist from the colors they choose. They aren't thinking specifically about putting certain colors into their mixtures for flesh tone. They're, you know, for the most part, we're all honestly reacting to an observation that we see. And when we're doing something like this, a master copy, you know, I'm not even interpreting a live model in a lighting condition. I'm just observing a two-dimensional reference, and from that two-dimensional reference, I'm asking myself, what is the value? How light or dark is that shape? And then from there, is it more red or more yellow or more blue? And since I have a predetermined red and yellow and blue, those are my only choices. And so, you know, every one of these mixtures, every single one, contains a certain percentage of yellow ochre, cadmium red, and ivory black. There's no color on that whole torso which is just one or two of those colors plus white. Each of them has a little bit of all of the colors. And so you could ask me what mixture any of those colors on here is, and it's always the same answer. It's cad red, yellow ochre, ivory black, and white. What you really need to understand is it comes down to the proportion, the percentage. And that'll change depending on which pigment you use. You know, you may use alizarin for this painting as your red instead of cadmium. And then you'll notice that the proportion of alizarin that you need to add into each mixture is going to be very, very small, because alizarin is such a strong color. But ultimately, it just comes down to your ability to manage your reds, blues, and yellows. So we're getting pretty close now to the actual colors and values of everything, which means the next sitting will probably be the last for working on this torso, where I'll be able to put in my final scumbles and glazes as needed. So we'll just try and pull together in the last remaining amount of time basically as close as I can to getting everything right. And at this late stage in the game, I won't be doing any major shape changes. I'm just kind of modifying the shapes I have to work with, or have up here, and working with those. And if this were a more finished painting, I might potentially go back and add more information or change some shapes if something was really wrong on here, because I really want my drawing to be good. But if I was going to do that, I would try and scrape down as much of the paint as possible before laying down in a new area with more pure color. But I'll always build it up this way before I come in with those final glazes and final scumbles. You may have noticed too, during almost this whole demonstration, I very rarely am cleaning my brushes, which is kind of refreshing sometimes, to not have to dip your brushes into terp so much. Now when I'm painting a direct painting, like an alla prima painting, and I'm working from shape to shape to shape, it becomes pretty important to keep clean brushes. When you're working alla prima and you're having to do some finishing strokes right off the bat. But with what I'm doing here, sort of bouncing around, slowly approaching things, working with a very limited palette, which is not very colorful in point of fact, it's less and less important to clean my brush off because I'm really only using 3 colors, right? The red, the yellow, and the blue. So if I end up with too much yellow on my brush, and I need to be getting to a color that's more red, for example, I can still use my brush without cleaning it off. I just add more red or blue to my color mixture. And so I can go the whole session without even cleaning off my brush. And at most, I might need to wipe it off a little. If I'm really going to a whole new color family, I might wipe it down a bit to maybe, say, clear off that red, which can get kind of powerful. But there isn't a huge need, like there is in some other styles of painting, of cleaning off your brushes religiously. Which for me is nice just because my hands can get really dry sometimes. Always using the paper towel, because I don't use gloves as much as I should. Going in here with a smaller brush for some of my darks. You don't want to get tricked into thinking that that shape on the shoulder is really, really dark. It's actually just got a really sharp edge next to it. And it's next to a relatively light color, so it's tempting to think that it's kind of dark, but it's not too dark. So you have to be careful. See, that was too dark. Start to slowly build up the value, but not by using white. If something like this happens and I need to lighten it up, I want to keep that color rich, so I'm not going to use white to lighten it. I'm just going to be using my cad red and my yellow ochre. And it slowly starts to lighten up that mixture, but keep it nice and rich in color. going to add a little bit more color to her cheeks, just to help me with my perception of it, in relationship to the rest of the body. So when I end this session, I'm going to want everything to be probably, well, all my shape to be 98 to 100% done. So I've worked out all of that, and I want my color to be, 90 to 95% done, and my values to be pretty spot on. So 95 to 100% done, so that the final touches I add are literally just that. They're final touches, little accents, little final details, maybe slight color modulations of areas, but nothing too dramatic, if I can help it. Because that last little pass, I'm not going to want to do any scraping. It's going to be just a final scumble or glaze, and that's it. Needs to go quite a bit darker in here, in the trapezius there. So again, when you're going in for your dark notes, make sure that you are dipping into portions of your puddles, your paint puddles that are nice and clean, that don't have too much, that you haven't touched a brush that has white on there. You'll end up fighting a losing battle. And I may need to throw a little oil on there in this mixture to knock down the glare that I see in that shadow area. Had to work a little harder to find some uncontaminated paint there. Just don't be so stubborn that even if it's the end of the painting session like this, if you need a little bit of fresh paint out, you should lay it out. Don't just try and power past it, because you might lose your color. some little reds in here. Now, when you're skilled, you'll probably be able to, well, eventually, we're talking years down the road, once you get to Alma-Tadema status and Bouguereau status, you could probably knock this out and get it pretty close to the accuracy here and the level of finish here in a few passes, maybe even 1 or 2 passes, and then just go on for a final stumble on top of it. But as you're learning here, even though we're trying to be like the masters and get it as close as we can, keep in mind that the working method here would be to build it up as needed until it's reached a level of finish that looks highly realistic. So if you need 6 or 7 or 8 passes or something like this to do your master copy and get it to look right, then go ahead and do that. Don't just stop because they might have only done 3 or 4 passes. And in fact, if I had enough time, I would like to do probably 5 or 6 passes at this to build it up. That would be the level of attention and detail I'd like to give to this, given enough time. But for a demonstration, this will do pretty nicely. Along with the scumbles, the last session, I will come in and do final accent details. So I'll be taking out the really tiny brush. I'll finish off like the nipple, maybe some of the contours in here to get just a little bit more precise with. And I'll handle all those little finishing bits in one day. So it's almost like you can think of the majority of this working as we have the last couple sessions, as just a sort of like a block-in that you take a little further each time. And that might relieve some of the stress from trying to do something like this, as opposed to a sergeant where you're trying to work stroke for stroke for stroke and you really hit it. This you're kind of doing a block-in, developing that block-in, and then taking the block-in a little further, just an advanced block-in, and then you block in a little more, and then a little more, and a little more, until eventually the painting starts to finish itself. Get some of these last transitions in here. It's a little bit in this armpit. So the next sitting that we do here for this one will be kind of with the intent to finish. So that's when I have to really put on my game face. It was that last day. And we'll just scrub in a little bit of the halftones in here, which will, by establishing some color in the surrounding areas, will help me to, again, better gauge a higher level of finish for the painting, just like with the background that I did there. So I'm just going to kind of get some general areas in here. Again, I'm going to go nice and thick here. I'll end up scraping this down again, so I don't have to worry about too much impasto. It'll get really fun, all this application. Really try to almost treat it like a color sketch, actually. I like to encourage students to do color sketches, to use up old paint, and don't use any medium. Just go as thick as you can. Just respond instinctively to the color you see, and that's essentially what we're trying to do here. There's a tendency when we stare too much at a color to lose our ability to get sort of the fleeting impression of the color. And so this blocking idea gives you really a chance to just bounce back and forth and throw it on there as quickly as you can, and hopefully what you end up putting down there is a pretty good example of your reference, just sort of blocked in, more pure. And so if we look at some half-finished paintings by Alma-Tadema, we can see him kind of doing this. As he starts to finish an area out, he starts to scrub in more and more information in the surrounding areas. Can help you see where you're going. You can even lay in paint and mix even a little directly on the canvas too at this stage, which a lot of painters would do, especially if you're going to do the scrape down method. This allows you to get a lot more broken color, a lot more chroma, especially with a limited palette. Remember again, the intent is, at least to some degree, to be starting a little bit higher chroma on here, so that as we come back in and work in more information, we can compensate for the decrease in chroma. Again, just flicking my eyes back and forth a lot. If you're looking for ideas for master copies, Alma-Tadema is great just because he has so many nice small paintings, so you can really see the quality and the buildup of the paint application. Sargent is good if you can find a head, Sargent head. Any of his genre paintings are probably a little too large to successfully shrink down and give you clues onto how they were painted. There's some Rembrandts that are an appropriate size, but for the most part they're rather large. Franz Hals are great because you can really see the brush application in a lot of those paintings. And there's some good landscapes too, like Corot. Corot has some nice small landscapes, and even actually Corot has a lot of really great figure paintings, like these little tiny, maybe like 12 by 16 genre figure paintings of girls holding or playing a musical instrument, things like that, and they would be great to do a master copy of. All right, just about done blocking in some of these surrounding colors here. Really helping me get a feeling for the flesh tones in here. Making sure I'm doing all of this correctly up in here. It might even be advantageous just to scrub a little color on the pillow there. Got this purplish color. It's pretty interesting. Keep in mind too that this color combination that I'm using is just one of many possible color combinations, and the colors that I'm mixing for this Alma-Tadema copy might not even reflect the true Alma-Tadema painting, because it's subject to the image that I pulled this from as well as the printer that we used here. So I could be 100% wrong on all these colors from this painting. Because I'm just going off of the information, the reference photo that I had to work with. But like I said before, even if you're not getting the colors of the actual original, there's so many other important things to be thinking about with this master copy than color. And so I'm trying to work mostly on the building up of paint, the way that he would have built it up, the application of paint, as well as the subtlety of color shifts, and that subtlety of color shifts will be true regardless of what copy I'm utilizing. So it's not a huge deal if the colors on this copy aren't quite right, because any copy will show some really subtle color shifts, even if they're not the same color shifts. All right, and that's going to be it. We'll scrape this down and pick it up for our final session. All right, so we'll come in here for our last scraping so that we can come back next sitting and finish this off. So again, the same rules are going to apply here. I'm just going to lightly be pulling off any excess paint. Softening some of these transitions little bit by little bit by little bit. I'm going to have to be a little more careful this time than the first time I did the scraping. I've got a little more paint filled up and I haven't waited quite long enough to scrape this. I really want to give it a few hours, but if I were to wait until tomorrow to do this, which would be my only option, then this might be a little too set up. And it could be completely dry. I was using some lead white in some of these flesh tones, and the risk there is that it's going to dry a little quicker than I would anticipate. But any areas that are a little too jumpy, we can clean up in the final sitting. So I'll just come along here and smooth this out, and then the last day I'll probably end up oiling it out just a little bit, and maybe if I have to, sanding it, but I probably won't need to sand it. It'll be so smooth. So again, even though I'm calling this a scraping, I'm really just sort of gliding over the top here, removing any excess paint, letting it blend in some areas. Sometimes I'm going with the stroke, sometimes I'm going against the stroke. I only want to go against the stroke if the paint has set up enough. So it'd have to be really tacky or even dry, completely dry. And then strokes that are going this way, I might scrape down this way. If I do that now, though, I'm probably just going to end up mixing too much of my color, and I'll lose a lot of the transitions that I've built up here. But you can almost consider this mixing or blending, softening as you would with a brush. Only it stays cleaner. It's similar to the principle of why we would do our color charts with a knife instead of a brush. You clean off that knife, and it stays nice and clean, and you can mix the next color. You're not having to clean off in between each color with soap and water. One of the things too that's great about softening with a knife as opposed to a brush is sometimes when we're softening with a brush, we have this tendency where if there's a shape that doesn't look quite right, we tend to try and grab that piece of paint and pull it into an area and sort of adjust the shape when we're softening things out. And when you do that, you may correct the shape a little bit, but then you sometimes sacrifice the edge quality or the value or color, and then you end up having to go repaint that area anyway. So this prevents you from trying to correct your shapes while you do this, and just keeps you softening, which is good. Keeps you honest. I am periodically referring back to the reference just to make sure an area that I'm about to go scrape and soften is actually to some degree soft on the reference. If I'm working from life, I don't always do that. I'll already have an idea of what needs to be soft and what doesn't, but this just keeps me from perhaps over scraping an area. will step back too, even while I'm softening edges, because there will be some edges like in here, you know, that look so soft up close, but when I step back, it kind of stands out as a hard edge, which is because my edges and my shapes are so tightly knit at this point that anything that's standing out a little bit can stand out a lot. So stepping back will help me to see some of those little tiny pieces where maybe it's just a tiny little extra bit of paint there is causing an area to look overly hard or soft. I'll even to some degree, as you see back here, scrape one area, like that background, into the breast to kind of obscure that edge. That's something I can seek out next week and get a little more specific with. And I might not necessarily want to commit to that right now, that shape, 100%. Also keep in mind that this is not something you can do if you were too thin in your paint application. You have to make sure you're really putting on enough paint. You know, paint load your bristle brush while you're putting it on here. Otherwise, you'll try to do this at the end of the day and you really will just scratch your paint film and you won't be able to soften one transition into the next. So you have to get comfortable with making more bold mixtures in your on your palette, because you really have to gather up enough paint. And that's probably one of the hardest things for students, is to get enough paint in their paint mixture. And even with a you know, more fluid, looser type of paint style, where we're using medium, it's still hard to get students to use enough medium, or I'm sorry, enough paint in their mixtures. But I almost think of this like sculpting. You know, if I give myself enough clay while I'm painting, then at the end of the day, when it's time to do all this little subtle molding, I actually have something to work with. This will go a little greenish over here next time. Maybe a scumble. Now, if there was an area where I felt I had really fleshed it out nicely and it was completely done, and I wanted to leave those strokes on there, I would not be scraping it. I'm only doing this because, again, I'm anticipating going on top of it and putting more information. almost done here. Now some of the peripheral areas to the torso, like the shoulder for example, probably needs a bit more build-up before I would be ready to go in for some finishing strokes on there. You know, it's I only really got around to starting to describe it today, so there's a lot of misinformation there as far as the color is concerned. But I'll do my best next week as I lay in some details. I'll also fine-tune that and bring it a little closer, and that would be kind of the method that the rest of a painting would be sort of sorted out. You know, you finesse an area to a level of finish, and then you indicate the surrounding areas a little more, just to get it into context. So I particularly enjoy this style of painting, especially when I'm interested in describing textures and getting really almost trompe-l'oeil about the textures. You know, alla prima in direct painting is great because you get to sort of fool the viewer into thinking something is real, and then they get up close and they see that it's actually just a paint stroke. But with this style of painting, it's a little bit different gratification, because the idea is that somebody comes up here to look at your painting, and instead of saying, oh wow, that's just a brush stroke, they say to themselves, oh wow, it looks like the pores of flesh, or the fuzz of a peach, or that actually looks like real marble there. So it becomes a different sort of excitement that comes out of a painting like this than some of the direct paintings that I do. And both are fun. So it just kind of depends on what I'm interested in doing. If I'm interested in describing textures and getting some of this more trompe-l'oeil look, then I'll paint this way and build it up this way. And just spend time sort of observing and noodling and getting something closer and closer and closer. But you know, if I'm interested in capturing something very fleeting, maybe a light source or a light on something, or you know, I don't have a lot of time with the subject or model, and I just need to indicate the facts and get an impression of what's there, then alla prima, you know, really direct painting is my go-to. So it's good to be able to do both. Both have their purpose, and both do a great job at basically just fooling the viewer into, you know, creating this illusion here. So keep that in mind as you go forward. You don't want to be stuck into just doing one way of working, one way of doing things. And this shoulder blade definitely needs a little more work, or the scapula here. Oh, sorry, the clavicle. That's it. There we go. The trapezius is still a little too on the blue side, and the clavicle now has kind of lost its shape. So that is something that needs to come in to play next sitting. But it's getting a little closer. The rest of this will just kind of knock down. We don't want it to be too overpowering when we lay on top of it. So we'll just give everything a nice little scrape over here. So we built up, captured all those little ridges of paint on there just by scraping along the leg. I didn't scrape any of the values off, but or the paint off, but I did get all of the ridges off there, and it did help to just soften each of those little areas into each other. So when you look up close, you still see a lot of variety. There's pinks and greens and yellows and going into purples, but they do blend rather nicely with the scraping. I'm just going to scrub that in there. You can do quite a bit more scrubbing like this with a knife. You can get away with it and not making things muddy than you can do with a brush. If I were to do that with a brush, I would destroy all of that shape. I would destroy all that color and all those values. But with a knife, look how much I can do. It just softens it all out. Brings one shape into another. It's almost that airbrush effect. Make sure you're doing this with a flexible knife. It should have some nice spring and bend to it. If you're doing it with a rigid knife, you will just scrape all of this off. And then our background here. Got to build that up next week. And there we go. We're all scraped up and ready for our next sitting.